There are damning new transcripts out today from a key witness in the impeachment investigation who testifies clearly and plainly to Donald Trump's quid pro quo in Ukraine. Ambassador Bill Taylor's searing testimony released by the House committees today, shedding new light on his alarm over the freezing of military aid for a U.S. ally, over the irregular policymaking channel with a direct line to Donald Trump that sought to cut out his own State Department and NSC, and on the alarm expressed by former National Security Director John Bolton when the investigations were raised as part of a policy discussion about Ukraine. Taylor's transcripts underscore that people close to the president understood Trump was conditioning military aid on a public commitment from Ukraine to investigate the president's political opponents. From those brand new transcripts, Ambassador Taylor on the quid pro quo, questioner. And when you said that this was the first time I heard that the security assistance, not just the White House meeting, was conditioned on the investigation, when you talked about conditioned, did you mean that if they didn't do this, the investigations, they weren't going to get that, the meeting and military assistance? Taylor responds, that was my clear understanding. Security assistance money would not come until the president of Ukraine committed to pursue the investigation. Questioner, so if they don't do this, they are not going to get that, was your understanding? Taylor, yes, sir. Questioner, are you aware that quid pro quo literally means this for that? Taylor, I am. Taylor painting a haunting portrait of a foreign policy process that quite literally meant life and death to the Ukrainians had been hijacked by what he describes as an irregular policy channel run by Rudy Giuliani that went directly to Donald Trump. Quote from those transcripts, Taylor, in order to get President Zelensky and President Trump in a meeting in the Oval Office, they took from that May 23rd meeting that they needed to work with Rudy Giuliani. So they did. And perhaps most intriguing, since at this point, former National Security Advisor John Bolton remains an elusive and unwilling witness in the Aid for Dirt investigation into Donald Trump. There's this about a policy meeting on Ukraine that took place inside the West Wing, a meeting that Bolton abruptly ended when the topic of investigations came up. Taylor, when Ambassador Sondland raised investigations in the meeting, that triggered Ambassador Bolton's antenna. Political antenna. And he said, we don't do politics here. And so he ended the meeting. Taylor will be among the first witnesses to testify next Wednesday in the first public hearing of the impeachment investigation. Ambassador Taylor's testimony and his transcripts are where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us from the New York Times, White House correspondent Annie Carney. From the Washington Post, national political reporter Robert Costa. At the table, Matt Miller, a former chief spokesman for the Department of Justice, executive editor for Bloomberg Opinion Tim O'Brien, plus politics editor for The Root, Jason Johnson's back. Robert Costa, Ambassador Bill Taylor seems like the kind of witness to roll out on the first day because smearing him is as unseemly and unsightly as smearing Colonel Vindman. I'm not saying it won't happen. I'm just saying, what is the impact in terms of cementing in the minds of anybody who still sees up as up and down as down, the fact pattern around the quid pro quo of aid conditioned on dirt on the Bidens?
When I was at the Capitol all day yesterday and on Capitol Hill this morning, talking to top Democrats, they say they're taking their cues from Speaker Pelosi. Make this as nonpartisan as possible. Push back against the Republican talking points that this is a charged political process. And they've learned lessons from the Mueller investigation and witnesses they've called, like Corey Lewandowski. They want to have people in uniform, national security officials, to tell the story of President Trump's conduct in a vivid way and a compelling way that's convincing to voters who may be skeptical about this entire inquiry.
Annie Carney, I know John Bolton, as we described him, remains an elusive and unwilling witness, but he has been brought to life through the testimony of his direct reports and his colleague. And this vivid testimony in Ambassador Bill Taylor's transcript today that his political antenna went up when investigations were mentioned by Gordon Sondland, who has amended his original testimony, certainly paints John Bolton as someone who I think he said he's not the whistleblower, but he certainly seemed to share the concerns expressed in the whistleblower complaint.
I think that's right. Bill Taylor's testimony really paints a picture of two parallel worlds going on at the same time. The official process that was populated by career civil servants and ambassadors, and then this side project that was Giuliani and political appointees like Sondland running their own off-the-books foreign policy. And when John Bolton first came in to be the national security advisor, I think there was a lot of fear that this is a bomb thrower, that we don't know what he's going to do, that he's going to be more than Trump, like unhinged. And what we're seeing here is that in these two parallel tracks, he's falling into the one of the career diplomats and professionals who know that politics is not supposed to be part of this, is not supposed to be something you ask foreign powers to meddle in. And John Bolton quickly cuts off this July meeting when he thinks it's going in that direction and sees that this is inappropriate and doesn't have a place in the White House. So witness after witness, we're seeing John Bolton kind of on the right side of these two tracks of foreign policy.
Jason Johnson's nodding, so I'm going to get to him in a second. But Robert Costa, I know you cover John Bolton, and you have covered him and his circle throughout this scandal. Any sense of his impressions or his views about how extensively the testimony of Fiona Hill, the testimony of Colonel Vindman, the testimony of Bill Taylor details his conduct inside the West Wing?
Everyone who knows Ambassador Bolton knows he carries this old battered leather briefcase around, and he keeps meticulous notes of meetings. He has an almost photographic memory. And so Democrats who have talked to top Republicans inside and around this White House want him as a witness behind the scenes on a deposition, as a public witness, because he's such a face from different cable channels and his conservative media work. But he's waiting to see, Bolton's allies say, what the federal court decides on Don McGahn's case about whether White House officials can testify, because he's not going to just come to Capitol Hill on his own. He's going to let the legal process play out. But he is ready to talk about his outsider experience inside of this administration, someone who was alarmed, according to many of his associates, at many turns, not just on Ukraine, but on the president's conduct throughout the administration and how he conducted foreign policy.
Is there any indication, Bob Costa, from your reporting, that any of the testimony entered into the record by Fiona Hill or Colonel Vindman or Ambassador Taylor is different from his recollections of the alarm that he expressed, of the anger, the explosion he articulated to Ambassador Gordon Sondland, who had to revise his testimony yesterday, of describing Rudy Giuliani as a hand grenade that was going to blow up on everyone, and as describing, I guess, his old boss, Mick Mulvaney, as running a drug deal?
He may disagree with the characterizations of his emotions or his reactions to things, but that kind of language, that hard-edged language, that's very much how Ambassador Bolton speaks behind the scenes and sometimes publicly. He's someone who will use phrases to say things that are explicit about how he feels about situations and things he may feel are over the line. Because he's not just an ambassador, he's not a foreign policy official, he's a lawyer. And people say he sees things in black and white.
That's right. Also released today, Ambassador Taylor's dramatic testimony about a phone call about how military assistance for Ukraine was blocked, that he describes as, quote, stunning. Taylor, toward the end of this otherwise normal meeting, a voice on the call, the person who was off screen, said that she was from OMB and her boss had instructed her not to approve any additional spending of security assistance for Ukraine until further notice. I and the others on the call sat in astonishment. The Ukrainians were fighting the Russians and counted on not only the training and weapons, but also the assurance of U.S. support. All that the OMB staff person said was that the directive had come from the president to the chief of staff to the OMB. In an instant, I realized that one of the key pillars of our strong support for Ukraine was threatened. The irregular policy channel was running contrary to the goals of long-standing U.S. policy. And this about his nightmare scenario. Questioner, what did you mean by the nightmare? And what would the Russians love? Taylor, the nightmare is the scenario where President Zelensky goes out in public, makes an announcement that he's going to investigate Burisma and the election in 2016, interference in the 2016 election, maybe among other things. He may put that in some series of investigations, but he had to. He was going, the nightmare was he would mention those two, take all the heat from that, get himself in big trouble in this country and probably in his country as well, and the security assistance would not be released. That was the nightmare. I mean, it gives me chills to read this. I mean, this is a Vietnam War veteran. This is someone who was brought into the State Department by Mike Pompeo. And this is someone who replaced Marie Yovanovitch, who was smeared by Rudy Giuliani and his folks. I mean, how does this testimony not break through?
I think what comes across in his testimony is someone who is very credible, someone who has served his country for more than 50 years, including, as you said, in Vietnam. And it's credible not just because of who he is, but as he details in his testimony, because he took meticulous notes. He had 2 notebooks, one for phone calls, one for meetings. He reconstructed those in giving this testimony. And the thing that was really striking to me in reading his account is not just the way he answered questions from Democrats, but the fact that Republicans who have been very publicly defending the president and very publicly attacking some of these witnesses weren't able to poke holes in anything that he said.
Right.
They barely even tried. He came up there and gave this devastating account of how the president extorted the Ukrainian government, how he was executing a shakedown and using Gordon Sondland as his main channel to do that. And Bill Taylor finds out this and confronts Sondland about it and threatens to resign. And the Republicans didn't really take him on the mere facts of these questions at all. And I think that gives you a good preview of what next week is going to look like. What are they going to do when Bill Taylor is sitting before the American public detailing this course of events the way he did in the private testimony, and the Republicans don't have anything to challenge those facts?
You know, it's interesting when and I, I'm a student of public opinion my whole career in politics, and I'm astounded by how dramatically public opinion has swung, not just to openness to the investigations, but a majority of Americans supporting Donald Trump's removal from office suggests that the credibility battle has been waged in Bill Taylor and Marie Yovanovitch, and people who are describing extortion, a shakedown, certainly have credibility among a majority of Americans.
Yeah, and I think it's because this is what we've seen from Donald Trump, right? Like, the part of the transcript that really got me the most is when you hear Taylor talking about the fact that they were specifically dictating what they wanted President Zelensky to say. Like, it's not just good enough that you make an announcement. They were telling him to use phrases like "no stone unturned." Like, that's a normal phrase for Ukrainians to use, right? So the fact, but it's the same thing that we heard about Donald Trump dictating how the letter to explain the meeting in Trump Tower. This is what this administration does. They put the squeeze on people, and then they force them to use whatever sort of ridiculous language or presentation that they want. And that's, I think, why this is the one that broke through. People have been hearing from Cohen, from Mueller, they've been hearing that this is how this administration operates, like a bunch of gangsters. And that's why I think this really breaks through. And
it would seem that while people have been conditioned to Trump running anything he runs like a mob family, the one place where people might be uncomfortable with that is foreign policy.
Well, and I think that this is the latest straw man to be knocked down by the members of the GOP and other supporters of Trump who've thrown up these sort of bogus roadblocks in front of the inquiry. First, it was, well, there were no quid pro quos. Then we found out there were quid pro quos. Well, the whole thing is opaque. Then they made it transparent. Well, we haven't seen the transcripts. Now the transcripts are out. And when you read these transcripts, and their final defense of this is, well, he shouldn't be removed from office because this is just the typical horse trading that occurs in diplomacy and foreign policy. And when you read these, you realize that, of course, none of this is typical, and it reads like the way a mob family rolls. You could substitute the cast members' names from The Godfather in for, Trump could be Don Vito, Rudy could be Mike Hagan, Tom Hagen, and it would read like a script of people strong-arming someone that they want to get a bribe out of or make them do what they want. And the other shoe to drop in this is that it's going to go to TV. And I think the people watching this, and the thing that you're saying, Nicole, about public opinion being swayed, is there was this drip of leaks. Now the transcripts are out, and now we're going to roll into televised hearings, and it's going to affect more people's view of what this was about.
Andy Carney, I'm amazed, and I think that Trump has always benefited by the pace and the variety of stories. This has been a pretty intense and focused news cycle for 5 weeks, and that's part of why he can't seem to distract us away from it. But no quid pro quo was his defense very publicly. It was the talking point that he seemed to transmit to his allies on the Hill. You've now got page after page after page after page of testimony to precisely that. I mean, whereas the questioner is actually saying, you understand what a quid pro quo is, this for that. And I don't speak Latin, but even I knew that. What is the possibility that at some point they will all say, Damn right we wanted them to smear Biden for their military aid, and this is how we roll. And what are the prospects of other calls being of interest? And because it was pointed out to me that he continues to maintain it was a perfect call because that is the nature of all of his calls.
Well, we've seen the argument moving a little bit in the direction you're describing already, which is what I like to call quid pro so, which is like this argument that even if I did do it,
so what?
It's still not criminal.
That's
so
exactly what it is. Exactly what it is right now.
And it mirrors, it really does mirror their strategy that they had for Mueller, which was one, even if I did it, it wasn't criminal and I was allowed to do it. And also, undermining the process and saying this is a sham investigation, which we're seeing even as it goes onto TV. What I'm hearing from the White House is the strategy now is going to be there's no retroactive justice. We didn't get to have White House lawyers or State Department lawyers in the room then. And so this process is messed up from the beginning. And just because now it's going to be open doesn't change anything about this being a messed up process. So attack the process, say he's within his rights to do whatever he did. That's their MO here. One problem they will have as this goes to television is that they haven't had credible witnesses like this come up and testify on TV. We've only seen something like this happen twice. One was Michael Cohen, who was a questionable witness, someone who was a proven liar coming out and telling stories about the president. So it wasn't like someone like Bill Taylor or Vindman. And then the other one was Robert Mueller himself, where after a lot of buildup, that was a case where the book was better than the movie. It wasn't a compelling testimony. And here the question will be, we've read Bill Taylor's testimony now, but will seeing him and hearing from him and others be only strengthen the case?
Robert Costa, those are good examples of how the president was sort of suspended in time while there was roadblock coverage of someone other than him, something a close friend of his described to me as enraging him, that he's a sun king, and anything that blocks the sun from him bothers him on its face. But I'm also thinking of Christine Blasey Ford. And I remember understanding and hearing that while she was testifying, he found her to be credible, that he is such a sort of devotee of television that a little piece of his brain has to have some anxiety about the impact of hour after hour after hour and day after day after day of lifelong anonymous diplomats, people who make less than $200,000 a year, going on TV and talking about being worried about an American ally sort of losing life-saving weapons systems because Donald Trump wanted dirt on Burisma.
But you can already see on the horizon the way the Republicans are preparing right now to counter that. Later this month, the target date is November 20th, according to the Post reporting. The IG at the Department of Justice will release his investigation of the Russia investigation. And when you were at the Capitol this week, you hear Republican after Republican not want to engage on the substance of the facts of the president's behavior when it comes to foreign policy, but instead trying to turn the attention and the spotlight and the news cycle to the Russia investigation and the IG report and then whatever Attorney General Barr decides to unveil.
What if they don't find anything?
That's a challenge for Republicans. Senator Graham and others are convinced that the American people are going to find this of intense interest, but it could be a story that only lasts a few days. And another challenge for Republicans is not all the material may be declassified at this point. That's up to the Department of Justice.
I think that's a very high stakes play. I think that the president himself has been the one screaming at the top of his lungs for the country to move on for years. I think 3 years to be exact. But now he wants us to swing all of our cameras around from the Ukraine, dirt for aid scandal and cover Bill Barr's, globe-hopping Where's Waldo Attorney General trip to foreign capitals to look for dirt on his own intelligence agency? Really?
Yeah.
That's the plan?
Look, I mean, in one sense, he wants the world to move on. On the other sense, if you watch Sean Hannity every night, you'd still think Hillary Clinton was president. They haven't moved on from the Clinton investigation. So they want to move on when it's useful to them. Bob Costa's story in the Post today about what Barr is doing with this IG investigation information is really great. And I think one of the troubling things, you can see how they are trying to use this as counter-programming. When you have Lindsey Graham meeting with the Attorney General about the rollout of this report, something completely inappropriate, something we certainly never did when I was at the Justice Department, to meet with one side of the Hill to talk about the rollout of an Inspector General report, you can see them starting to come up with ways to counter-program the next few weeks. The president has announced today that President Erdogan is going to be here next week on Wednesday, the same day of the Taylor testimony, another high-profile event where they're going to try to have something to say other than, something for the world to talk about other than what's going on the Hill. Whether they'll be successful in that, I have no idea, but certainly it gives the channels they want people to watch something to talk about.
It is an incredible piece of reporting. Let me give you the last word on that, Robert Costa.
You're just seeing a Republican Party right now in the wake of the political race in Kentucky for governor and the suburban defeats across the country in places like the Philadelphia suburbs, on edge, but they have limited options in their view when you talk to them privately about how to handle the coming year. And so they're just not wanting to talk about the actual impeachment investigation and instead looking for ways to either duck and cover or just move forward and focus on other issues like the IG report. It's a Republican Party that's held together in a fragile way, but so far holding together because they see President Trump as the political capital they need.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.